Hola, everyone. Like we said, I'm Miguel Gutierrez. I use he, they pronouns. I'm zooming in from the traditional lands of the Lenape peoples, Lenape Hoking, which we refer to now as Brooklyn. Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction, Liz. Thank you, Arturo. And Andreina, thank you. And remember to tell me to go slow if I go too fast. And thank you most of all, Maria, for agreeing to have this talk with me today. And thank you, I want to say right from the get-go, thank you for all of the work that you've done to advocate for Latinx artists across the country. So my conversation with you today continues a line of research that I've been occupied with for almost a year, which I put under this name that was said in the introduction, Are You for Sale? Which is a line from a Morgan Parker poem, Welcome to the Jungle, and her book, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce. This research looks at the complicated ethics and entanglements between art making and money. And when I say money, I mean really like philanthropy funding. My hope is that with this area of research that I'm doing and this podcast that will come out later this year, is that we can bring increased transparency with these issues, regarding these issues, and bring into the light of day some of the conversations that only happen behind closed doors, but that affect all of us. So that's my intention, and that's my intention here with you. So now really I can just direct you, say directly to you, hola Maria.
Hola, hola Miguel, y hola a todos, and thank you and FLACC for the invitation. I am honored and humbled to speak to you about Latinx art aquí en los Estados Unidos, en Puerto Rico, en México, en Centroamérica, ¿verdad? Y toda Latinoamérica, pero me da mucho gusto estar aquí con ustedes.
Thank you. So I'm gonna just like jump right in. I have a lot of questions, and some of them are kind of thick, so I'm hoping that that is a good thing. But maybe we can just have you start by saying how you would describe what the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures does.
Well, I mean, we have NALAC, National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures, has been around for 31 years. And we are grateful for the founders that came from diverse communities, Chicano, Puerto Rican, Cuban, who felt the need to create an organization that would advocate and really begin to stabilize and create more visibility for Latino art, Latinx arts and culture here in our nation. So our constituency is very multi-generational, multi-ethnic, we're an interdisciplinary community, and we work in both urban and rural areas and support artists and organizations working in all disciplines. And so I think that I would say that NALAC is a transformative organization, and we have been investing in the educational, financial, and network building here in this nation. So creating a network of Latinx artists and organizations across the nation, and always looking at how we foster sites to where community belongs, and always looking to see who is not at the table, who is not in the room, where are the gaps. And so we want to organize community, create movement, and build the capacity and the stability of the Latinx arts here in this nation.
How does the organization measure its success, or how do you define your success? Do you feel like, I'm just curious to hear you talk about that.
Absolutely. I think that for us, the success is measured not only in the number of people that we serve, which includes, thousands of artists, hundreds of organizations here in this nation, but also the work that we do to really help them lift their voice and lift the visibility that they have in their own communities and in the national community. So, what is it that how is it that this nation and really sees Latinos here, and what kind of language are they using to define us and who we are? So I think that our success is measured how we can transform and how we can overcome these barriers and really uplift the voices and the stories of our communities, their expressions, their creativity.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of but one of the challenges in this, of course, is Latinx means so many different things. So many different kinds of people from so many different places. And what do you see as the challenges that you encounter with running an organization that is addressing such an enormous range of people who in many ways have been sort of institutionally, we have been put together, sort of, it's an institutional operation, I guess you could argue. How do you guys talk about that, or how do you think about that?
Absolutely, and I think that we're always looking to expanding how our communities are defined and integrated into the network. And for me, the NALAC umbrella is just that, an umbrella, something where we can come together and have conversation and share information and help to strengthen each other. And so I know the term Latino, Hispanic, whatever we want to call ourselves, Latinx, there's a lot of terms. I'm a Chicana, I'm of Mexican American origin. I like to call myself a term that a friend shared with me recently, Native American Mexican, because this is where I'm from. All of this area of the Americas is where I'm from, and I think that the more open we are to accept each other, I think it is really going to be the strength of who we are as NALAC, who this network is of very diverse people in this nation. And I think one of the challenges is that we are a growing community, and a challenge for us is how do we fully support and serve as many artists and arts organizations as possible.
What have been some of the flashpoints of that conversation within NALAC? I'm just curious if you could share.
Well, I think that recognizing that we are not, that it's not just a conversation of a binary, but being very inclusive of gender, and finding a different, accepting the many ways that people define each other, accepting younger voices, and at the same time those voices that have been more established. So I think that some of the flashpoints, I think, were at this point, I think, are really looking internally at the Afro Latinx conversations and how we approach those in our own Latinx, Latino communities. And I think that is something that people are coming to terms with. And I think those are important conversations that we need to have. And another, especially right now at this moment, you know, when there is so much, so many movements around racial justice and social justice, is to really to support and recognize and prioritize the leadership of Black people and the sovereignty of Indigenous people here in this nation. And that in no way takes anything away from us as Latinx communities. So I think those are conversations that are ongoing. And I don't know if I answered your question fully.
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate that you landed on really specific, you know, aspects of the community, and I do agree with you. I think there is a kind of there has been, I think, in the last few years, a sort of reckoning because there is a lot of intra Latinx community racism and colorism and class differential. And so I think for me, it speaks back a little bit to my original question of sort of, how do we hold all this? So like, what does the responsibility become for an organization that is placing, you know, it's not called National Association of Afro-Latino Arts and Culture. It's not called National Association of Indigenous Latinos Art. You know, so how does language delimit our possibilities for intersectional affiliation? And that's something I really pointedly in funding, right? Because in funding as an artist, you often feel like you have to make a decision of what part of myself am I gonna face forward with or put forward in order to get money, you know, to support the work. So those kind of complex negotiations that happen within artists' lives. That's why I'm asking the question a bit, to see how the institution is thinking about that.
You know, to always be true to yourself. Be true to yourself. And at NALAC, you know, how if you define yourself as a Latinx artist, especially for our grant programs, the NALAC Fund for the Arts, it is the only grant program specifically for Latinx artists and organizations here in this nation. You self-define. We don't, you know, if you say you're a Latinx artist, you know, and whatever kind of work that you're creating doesn't have to be traditional, can be contemporary, can address so many issues. You know, we accept that, and we really want to honor the work of artists, of so many artists that never get seen, never get, you know, heard from. And so our organizations, our community of artists, you know, we have stories to tell, and our work is important. And really, you know, we form a big, you know, strong part of this nation, you know, and how our stories tell our, you know, our struggle, the inequity, you know, and I think that we have to make room for that in the work that we do.
So kind of speaking about the work that we do, something I've noticed over the last, well, not last few years, but throughout the course of my artistic career, and of course there was a long history before I started doing my work, is in funding language, there being this increased centering of work, the desire to fund work that centers social change. Would you agree that that's been an evolution in the field? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think in philanthropy, it has been an evolution, and I think with our community of artists, our arts and culture community, it has always been there in the work that we do, and we express it in different ways. But you know, yes, philanthropy is now taking a longer look and a broader look at that. But it's not to say that it's the only work that they're supporting. You know, there's still they're still supporting a lot of the mainstream.
Sure, but I think so. I have such a complicated relationship to the way that that language has evolved. I think on the one hand, there's the reorganization of a notion of what aesthetic standards are supposed to be, and making space for kind of work. That's the delivery, the food that just got here. Dinner. Sorry. But the aesthetic frameworks opening up to include a kind of work that hasn't had its place at the table, as you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's this one component of this focus on social change, doing that. But I also feel that on another level, that centering of that focus from the philanthropy perspective or the funding perspective speaks to a governmental failure, speaks to a failure at the level of local government, state government, federal government, to provide necessary services for communities, including most importantly communities of color and working class communities. And so the artist is now positioned to fill in this space potentially. And I think often artists of color are especially burdened with this idea of, okay, well, we don't give you the services you need from the government perspective, but will you please serve as social workers in the community with your art? Because your art isn't enough, actually. You have to also do this extra labor. And I like I said, it's a very, that's a very reductive way of framing the problem, but I do feel, I just have to say that from my perspective as an artist, that sometimes it feels like you're sniffing that out when you hear feedback, when you don't get something, and like there's this term, the community, how is it serving the community? And you're like, well, isn't the work serving the community?
Absolutely, the work is serving the community, so how do we support and sustain those creatives, and those of you who keep the culture, and I think that this exactly what you expressed, of what is worth funding and what is not, what aesthetic has value and what does not, and the fact that this has been ignored for so long, and that there is really no understanding of the value of the work that's created. And so if it's a work by a person of color, oh yes, so it has to be absolutely about community. Community is important. You create the work based on the living, your experience as a human in your own community, and that expression, is what is really exhibited. And so there has to be a value to that, and the fact that funders many times don't understand or appreciate the aesthetic, I've seen that, and I know people have seen that as we sit in funding panels, whether it be private or public philanthropy, and that has to change, that people don't understand, well, why do they do that? I don't see the value in that, and that cultural competency to understand the work that's done. And so it is that rigor of the work that is so important. And if it serves community and addresses other social issues, there's I'm not saying that it has to be one way or the other. I don't think that many of us, maybe they do, create art for art's sake, but
I don't know that for me, it's a question of art for art's sake as much as a criticality around the idea of what community means. And that community means different things for different people. And there are those of us who come from geographic community that is Latinx specific. There are people who don't. There are people who move to Latinx specific community. there are all kind. Migration is a kind of ongoing process as an artist, and how it relates also to economy, opportunity, education. Like I said before, class. So it's just it sometimes feels like to me that the funding community is making an equation between the funding community is making an equation between community, geography, proximity, and measuring a notion of impact based on that. Which again, I think that's any artist who's doing that. I have no issue with an artist who's doing that, but there is sometimes the question for me of like, what is not, why, what are the expectations on this artist, and do we shapeshift ourselves and our work to meet these sometimes sort of implicit funding guidelines that, you said it doesn't have to be one way or the other, but it's like, I wonder, like in the rooms, in those panel discussions, what is actually being said and what kind of judgments are being made and what assumptions are being made about what impact should look like or sound like, so this is kind of where I'm trying to understand something.
And I guess I when I say it's not one way or the other, I mean, I'm talking about for NALAC, for us, whatever the work is, and how it is created and presented, we accept that. But absolutely, I hear you about the assumptions that are being made in these panels, in these rooms where decisions are made, how to really resource so many organizations and unfortunately so few artists. If the artists are at the core of what our organizations are about, any organization, and I think that funders need to go back and say, look, are we really going to support this creativity that stems from the artists? And how do we begin to change that? How do we begin to really create practice a more participatory grant-making process where the artists are saying, this is the kind of work that we'd like to see supported, and these are the people that we think should receive the funding. So how do you make yourself, how do you make your way into those conversations and really insert yourself in those conversations, and really bring together a collective voice of people that may not be only Latinx, but that may be an intercultural group, that has more power, to really begin to make these changes and these points. But unfortunately, for example, in many in those panels, the people that get favored, are more of the people who understand more of the Eurocentric mainstream work, and so you're in a place where many times our organizations, our artists get little in the way of funding. And for example, if you look at the National Endowment for the Arts, for years and years now, it's been a long time, that Latinx organizations get less than 5% of the funding in this nation, and many times these organizations stopped applying because of that, because of constantly being, rejected. So how do we make those changes within the NEA, and also become these advocates in our community, where in our communities, and advocates that really began to take part in either being on panels or speaking up, speaking truth to power, and understanding that is also a responsibility.
I mean, so this actually hits two different areas of questioning that I'm interested in. In this research that I'm doing around philanthropy and art making, one of the things that emerges, of course, is the roots of philanthropy, which have a lot to do with the deeply problematic roots of this country's idea about wealth accumulation, wealth hoarding, and the select few deigning to give some of this wealth to the needy, right?
Yeah.
This kind of reputation laundering that certainly the late 19th century, early 20th century philanthropists were engaged in, and now, right, with tech philanthropists, basically people who have very exploitative companies, who then in turn are like seen as these golden rods of generosity, when they could just pay their employees more, right? So things like that. But so my question then is like, what does it mean for Latinx artists, who so many of us are coming, well, all of us are coming from really territories, areas, countries that have such a challenging relationship to El Norte, like the North American, the USA based just fuckery that has been imposed on Latin America. What does it mean for us to participate in this funding system that has its roots in this capitalist structure of improper wealth accumulation, income disparity, hoarding? Like, I know I'm saying a lot, but hopefully putting it all together. Estoy diciendo mucho? Okay. Oh no, sorry. Oh no. Oh sorry. I thought Andrea.
Yeah.
Okay.
One second.
Pause.
Yeah, I was interpreting. There you go. I think the interpretation.
Okay. Estamos bien. So, for example, when you participate in this system as an artist, you are agreeing to be pitting yourself against other artists who are also marginalized, right? You're in this, you're putting yourself there. You are not compensated for your labor when you apply. And in many cases, some of us are applying over and over and over for things. And for grants that aren't that much money to begin with in the grand scheme of things, right? Certainly none of those things are going to be enough money to pay for our lives. And then it puts you in this damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if you do get it, great, you got it, but you aren't going to get it again. Or at least it's going to be a couple of years. And if you don't get it, you don't have the support that you need. And you're now waiting for the next year's funding cycle, because funding cycles are often just once a year.
Right.
And it's something that's just been really boggling my mind. Like, there is no other system. This is the one. How are funders talking about? How is NALAC talking about this? How are you thinking about this and what you've seen? I'm curious if it resonates.
Well, I think that because advocacy is so central to the work that we do, and that advocacy is something that we take into communities, whether it's into funding rooms, whether it's national, local, regional, always speaking up about the need to, what's called, liberating that money. And really, if they're talking about equity, that that funders put their money into these communities of artists, of organizations that have not been funded, in the past. So what is it that needs to happen? I think that as we collectively advocate, I think this change will come. But change doesn't happen overnight. Change is a long time coming. So the work that's being done right now, we're not going to see necessarily, as far as funding, immediate changes in those areas. I think that right now, during this time of Black Lives Matter, I think more funders are beginning to take a look at that and saying, okay, let's provide more funding in this area. But still, in the grand scheme of things, as to how philanthropy and how much of those funds they provide. It's still it's the same. It's the same. So how do we begin to change that? And we certainly look at the funding that we receive as something that we can use to transform. So there is that grant speak that you have to put down on paper, but then how do you really use those funds to really help artists, help others do the work that they truly want to do? And unfortunately, as NALAC, as a service organization, we don't have, we go through the same inequitable process of funding that many organizations do. As a national organization that supports so many Latinx community, a growing Latinx community, where are those funds that we need to really support the work that you're doing if others are not doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of precisely what I'm saying, though. It's kind of we all kind of agree to the bind, and then to what extent do we then replicate? I mean, I'm being a little dramatic here, but the language of the abuser or the I mean, not, this isn't like, I'm not trying to be like, why are you doing this? But like, even in NALAC, you guys have the national grants are $10,000, but the local grants are $5,000, right? Like the Puerto Rican grants or the San Antonio grants are only $5,000. So for me, that just speaks to kind of these allegedly necessary divisions that we construct about value.
Yeah.
And where have we learned that, and why are we absorbing that and then replicating it? Why does a Puerto Rican artist only get 5,000, but a person from Arizona can get 10, right? These kind of questions that jumps out to me. I'm curious how you feel about that.
Right, and they're very much related to funding. So any artist, whether you're in San Antonio or Puerto Rico or wherever you are, you can apply for the $10,000 grant. And so we created these other smaller grants with funds. For example, the artists in San Antonio, those funds come from the city of San Antonio, and they're saying, here's $30,000, support artists with this. So the choice is, do we give fewer artists $10,000, or do we distribute it, with a little over $5,000 to more local artists? But those local artists, of course, can apply for the larger grant, but it's very competitive. Sure. And that's what I'm talking about, that, for example, this year, we're able to award a little bit more, but it's only over 300,000 that we are awarding to artists across the nation in Puerto Rico, and many times even in Mexico and Central America through different transnational programs. So yes, the idea that more funds need to be raised. How do we bring in more of our community those members of the community that have resources to support the work? How do we work with them to help them seed the work of artists and arts organization, and understand the value of culture and art to really bring community together and really bring things to the human experience that nothing else can.
The irony, of course, is that I think, an organization like NALAC, like you said, you also then become a member of, like, you also then end up in this competition, right, for resources. Because I was thinking, like, looking at the site and seeing, okay, for example, Ford Foundation supports NALAC. Ford funds, universities of all different sizes, NALAC. It also funds other identity-specific organizations like the Native Arts and Culture Foundation. And it also funds artists, right? So, and then NALAC becomes a funder, right? So there's like Daddy Ford, and then, and then mommy mommy NALAC, you know, like it's and a part of me is like, why do we need these intermediate organizations, or is this a necessary mediation or a necessary translation? These are terrible words, but what that then has to redistribute the support, or why not just get Ford to open their eyes and be like, keep giving this money out, give more of this money out, give it, all these, like, hopefully at the end of the day, an organization like NALAC shouldn't have to be necessary.
No, you're absolutely right.
Right?
You're absolutely right. It shouldn't have to be necessary, but the racism in our community is what makes it necessary. Because let's say Ford Foundation or anyone else, so they say, well, are we going to make grants to 2,000, 3,000, artists and do the management of all that? No, so they use us and I'm saying NALAC as an intermediary organization as a pass-through. In many cases, they do not, the Ford Foundation has, but others, they don't support necessarily the infrastructure of the organization. They say, here's the money, put it through, and many times, for example, like with the NALAC Fund for the Arts, that we were dreaming about this, kept hearing from our community for years, that we need resources. So the Ford Foundation, we went to them and we said, okay, we knew that they were going to make those grants to the people that we support. So we said, how do we get our hands on these funds and then really provide them to the artists, the Latinx organizations in our communities? It would be wonderful if foundations could just directly provide that support. And, with the National Endowment for the Arts, they're supporting organizations now, only because of the culture wars and all of that happened in the 80s and the 90s. And so artists can't go directly there anymore to get funding because it's been legislated that way, So funding has to go to an organization, and then the organization will hire the artist and so forth, and that's such a, that is such a winding road for funds to get to artists, and that's why I said at the beginning, the foundations should really think about, how do you put the artist at the center of the funds that they have to award?
I mean, for me, that speaks to kind of this ongoing challenge as a minoritarian artist, that you want legibility and you don't want it. You want to be acknowledged and seen by the forces that be, but you don't want too much of the scrutiny to stop you from doing what you're doing. Right. I mean, I love that you brought up the culture wars, because that's actually my next question. The culture wars of the 80s, 90s, which, saw an increased attention on the National Endowment for the Arts. And eventually that attention led to the elimination of the individual artist fellowships in the mid-90s. That partly all got started off by Andres Serrano, Latinx artist, woo!
And Mapplethorpe,
and Mapplethorpe. But I want to recuperate Andres's role in that mythology a little bit. Yeah. We've heard enough of Mapplethorpe for a lifetime, but he did his piece, His Christ, and that was such a thing. Earlier this year, I know you're aware of this, Sandra Ibarra, Oakland-based artist, had her work, Spectacle 2, La Tortillera, removed from Chicanx, a group show at Centro de Artes in San Antonio, by the San Antonio Departments of Arts and Culture. So, again, to this thing of legibility and identity, I'm wondering, do you think that there is a pressure for Latinx artists to maintain a respectability politics in regards not only to the dominant culture, but within Latinx communities? I mean, I feel like Sandra's experience was very much that. And how does NALAC deal with these kind of charged, or what is the conversation happening at NALAC about charged works or works that deal with sex and sexuality directly.
Yeah, absolutely. We support the creativity of all artists, and we do not censor. We do not believe in censorship. And for us, we are not asking artists to fit this respectability. I don't know, the box of respectability. And I don't think that most communities are really asking that, and what happened in San Antonio, we were there speaking to the powers that be there in the city, to the attorney, saying, no, do not censor the artist. If what the artists create is really something that we need to value and uphold and respect for whatever it may speak to. And so that's the irony of so many things. So you're in San Antonio, you were in a city that is almost 70% Latinx, and many times, the people in power in city councils, the people that control the money are also Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, whatever they want to call themselves, and yet, the funding in those places, for example, if you look at San Antonio, 70% of the population, about 15% of the funding goes to Latinx organizations, and forget artists, they're not supporting artists, which is why they're putting $30,000 through NALAC so that they can say, oh, we're supporting artists, and that's a measly amount, and then in Houston, the same thing. People asked us to go in and do some research. We did. We raised some local money. And, in a city where Latinos or the majority of the population, they get less than 7% of the funding from the city. And forget about, private philanthropy. They're just not supporting us, and we see that over and over. The same things happening across the nation. So it's this, I don't know, this idea in these government agencies that there is a certain, I don't know, a certain framework of respectability or something that needs to be upheld, And for us at NALAC, we always support the artists, always support the organizations, and we will stand up against censorship anytime.
Yeah, that's heartening to hear, and I do know that you guys stood behind Sambra's work, and I know she's grateful for it. She wrote that in the chat, and I mean, I think what you're saying. It makes me think about the ongoing tension between Latinx communities and the state. Which God knows that's been true forever, but wow, is it true now? In levels that are just like absolutely mind-boggling when you have a white supremacist president who is like, being whispered into his ear by the most Latino-hating person of all time, Stephen Miller. This is just so challenging. But so you sorry, that's just me going off.
Yeah, no. And I'm here what you say, so how do you subvert some of that, so in San Antonio, let's say, there's a West Side Arts Coalition. And so it's the 8 Latino organizations there in the city, we're always each doing our own thing, but we come together to advocate, we come together to plan and to strategize, and the same thing in Houston. After the study came out, they formed HALA, the Houston Alliance of Latinx Artists, and now they're out there advocating and building that leadership. So as a community, wherever you may be as an artist, it is also, like I said, the role of the artist to speak up for his work and to stand up with others and say, these systems need to change because the systems that are there are certainly, not the systems that we would like to work under, these capitalist systems, but it's what's available right now. So we say, how do we, with the funds that we can get, how do we transform it and in a way subvert what we get? Okay, funder, we're going to do this, but you know what, artists? go and do what you need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that we're all gaming the system in the ways that we can. We're trying to at different levels. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
you know, which of course, trust me, I'm a hustler. I completely understand that. But I think one of the questions that keeps coming up for me is like, what is another system? What is this? What is a system where I don't have to game it? What is a system where, you know, the city doesn't have to give $30,000 to you to appease their own conscience that they're supporting Latinx artists, you know, and then actually recognize the extraordinary array of Latinx artists that are actually there instead of just like funneling it through you guys, right? So, I mean,
absolutely. I hear you. And I don't know if you want to ask another question, but I just wanted to share another example.
Yes, share one other example. I do have one quick other question, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, just thinking about, you know, right now during this pandemic and how our communities of color, you know, Latinx communities are being so impacted because, you know, we are right there at the front line doing that work, whether it's in the fields or in the grocery stores or, you know, wherever we're working. And we know that artists were suffering, losing work and all of this. So we decided, well, let's put some money together to we created the Actos de Confianza, you know, acts of trust to provide funding to artists. And they were small grants, you know, and we only had $25,000 to begin with, you know, from NALAC's own resources. And we received almost 1,700 applications, you know, for $500 grants. And we gave those out. And then, you know, as we thought about it, you know, we work collaboratively with our partners from the Intercultural Leadership Institute, which includes, you know, First Peoples Fund, Alternate Roots, SIP Culture, PAI Foundation, NALAC, and we've been working together for a long, long time. And we created this Intercultural Leadership Institute, but we understood how our communities were hurting and suffering in our artist communities, you know, and we kept seeing that these larger, big organizations were receiving funds from foundations to provide to artists that maybe are more well known, but who's funding that mariachi down the street, or, you know, people who are not recognized as artists, you know. So in March we started, you know, we went collectively to a funder and we started, come on, you know, these funds that you're awarding to other organizations, they're not going to get into our communities, you know, they're not going to reach our artists. And so we worked through that for many months, and then we're able to get the Mellon Foundation to provide us $5 million collectively to distribute in COVID relief funds. So this collective activism is important, understanding that many times you need to, you know, get out of your silo and say, who else in my community can I work with? Can I work with the Native, Asian, you know, Black community? And how can we then begin to get resources that we need and to create change you know, because I think that change has happened because of the organizing and the activism of people, not because government or philanthropy, out of the kindness of their hearts, have decided to make that change. It is our voices and our activism that is gonna make that change.
I want to just, because this is just my last question, because you sit on the National Council for the Arts, and I want to assume that people know what the National Council for the Arts is, but my understanding is the National Council for the Arts is this advisory council of people from across the country, arts professionals, and when you apply for an NEA grant and if it gets approved by a peer panel, it then goes to the National Council for the Arts, which, you know, does the seal of approval on that, and then it gets you know, ultimate approval from the chairperson, who right now is Marianne Carter,
Right.
Trump appointee. And, you know, of course, the NEA 4 scandal in the 90s had to do with the panel approving the grants, the council rejecting the grants. Anyway, that's another podcast, another story, another question. But how are you seeing this conversation about support for Latinx artists happening at the federal level, happening at the NEA, happening on the council?
Well, there is so much scrutiny, of the NEA by Congress. It's legislated that they can't support artists directly except, for the Jazz Awards and some other awards. So the work there, the conversation there is a deep conversation about making these changes. When the NEA says, well, Latinos aren't applying, Latino organizations, well, then you get out there, we'll do our part and say, you have a 40% chance of getting a grant if you apply, but what are they doing to reach the community, and how are they bringing diverse voices to the table, to be those program directors. It is basically a very the staff is very white, male, and so we have those conversations with the chair, but then the rest of the work, for example, that I do with NALAC is with our legislators. And, as a council member, I can't really, while I'm there for a council meeting, I can't go and speak to a legislator, so we have to do that on our own time. So recently, we've been working with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus for a long time, and the chair right now is Joaquin Castro from Texas, and so we've been talking to them about the lack of diversity on the panels of voices of color, the lack of staff leadership that is of color, and the lack of really intensive outreach into our communities. And so they this year put in some legislation, I don't know if you're aware of it, that with the new bill that came through for support of the NEA, they put in a specific requirement that says that the NEA really has to do a better job of providing opportunities to communities of color, to underserved artists, and that within 90 days of the enactment of that act, that the NEA has to really answer now to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus about how they're meeting these goals of equity and diversity. And it's the first time ever that any kind of language has been tied to resourcing
That's great.
National Endowment for the Arts, and so that's work that's coming from many different folks, right? Some of us are on, some people are on the ground doing different kind of work. Others are working through legislation, through government. So I think that as we take our message to those that can make decisions, I think that's how the perhaps the change begins to happen. But it still doesn't change, the capitalist framework that we work under, and I know that a lot of artists or organizations, they're looking for a different model besides the 501c3 model, but for us, that's what we have right now, and say, yes, let's create something new. Let's think about creating something new, pero por ahorita, let's support in the best way that we can.
Thank you, Maria. It's been a lot. We've covered a lot of ground.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
Muchísimas gracias.
I want to give us a chance to do a little Q&A, but I also know we've been talking about super intense, thick stuff. Wonder if we could just all have a little moment. Yeah. I call this the money dance. It's kind of like fuck money, but we need it, pero lo queremos, pero no lo queremos. And maybe we could just have a little bit of music. Los segunditos, si se quieren parar, whatever. I gotta eat my food for 2 seconds, porque me estoy muriendo de hambre.
Give me the money, pero una cachetada.
Una cachetada, sí. Lo que quiero es comida. María, lo que quiero es comer. Oh, man. 2 minutos esto.
Sí.
Cosita buena la rumba. 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 Cosita buena la rumba.
Okay. I know, it's too short.
Wow.
Yes,
Podemos,
great time.
Wow.
podemos seguir después con la fiesta, pero I just want to make sure we got to questions also because I know that Adriana has been in the work of translation for over an hour now. So, but I guess Arturo, come in.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, guys, this has been an amazing conversation. I have been, well, thank you so much for the money dance. I feel immediately richer. I feel like $1 million right now. I don't know about you, but so I have been keeping track of some of the comments in the chat. By the way, for everybody who is following us on Facebook, come in. You can come in. We posted the links for the Zoom rooms over there, so you can just come in, get all of your questions in. This is a really cool opportunity to actually pick the brains of the minds of very brilliant people, very brilliant arts professionals that will, answer all of these questions. I want to contextualize some of what we have been hearing, talking about this idea, this funding system is a colonized paradigm. How would it work in outside of the capitalist system? What would an uncolonized funding system would look like? Wondering about the Zapatista Caracol system. The Caracol system is kind of like the congregation of towns of the Zapatista people. I had the opportunity to live in a Caracol with a family for a few weeks, so I can talk in depth about that, but we can on the side. Now, I think that the way that I am going to kind of like summarize and then add on my little bit of a point of view here, I think that it is important that we contextualize that we are living under a neoliberal system, right? This idea that government shouldn't exist, but rather we should privatize all the services. So all of these outflows, this creation of a lot of foundations and institutions, basically from corporations and major philanthropers, is a way kind of like to wash, like they donate $1 million to the arts or the education, and then they get tax cuts for hundreds of millions of dollars, right? There are different systems, like in Mexico with FONCA and Conaculta. We were hearing some ex was sharing a comment or an article with this senator that is trying to defund FONCA, to defund these big programs put in place by the government of Mexico. And then you also have another different system with Cuba and Venezuela, and the investments that they have been doing in the arts, and also all the corruption that has been happening with all of that. Now, I think that what I always keep thinking is we're still, the arts and culture are still living under this almost feudalistic system, where as long as you have a patron, you're good. But if you don't, it's going to be pretty hard for you to develop your talent, your art, your craft. I often think about the ways in which I personally work in development, and I am coaching artists to apply for different grants right now. And I think about how do we break down this mold of the grant application into life experiences of as easy as tell me about you, let's have a conversation and let's take notes, and then let's grab these notes and trying to conform all of these into a narrative, into a coherent narrative that then we can write in the paper, but kind of like starting from the other end. Because I think that when we sit down in front of a computer with an empty application, that's when we all kind of like have these difficulties. So with that, I want to ask people too. I already see many comments here, and I would love everybody to just share with us some questions. Maria, does this provoke any thoughts in you, these things that I was talking about?
No, absolutely. And I think that I think I mentioned that model of participatory grant making, right? And it's something that we are looking at right now and experimenting with. So we have a grant program called Border Narratives that we're doing for Ford, and it is really to illuminate, the stories of people living along the border, on both sides of the border, right? And they want us to focus on Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And so instead of putting out a call and saying, okay, anybody who is doing this work, apply, we identified some folks that we knew and other people had recommended to us, and we had what we called cafecitos, virtual cafecitos, where we brought people together. Well, what's happening in your community? How could this look? And with this grant, we're supporting 7 artists with $20,000 and 15 organizations with $75,000. To really tell those stories tell the stories along the border, and they're not only Latinx stories. Some of them are, Black stories of Black people and indigenous people and so forth. And so we brought people together. They recommended, the way that we should do this. So we really created a very simple process, where people can submit an application. So we asked these same people that were in the cafecitos and others, nominate somebody, and you can nominate yourself too. What is that work you want to do? And so right now we will be accepting nominations up through next week, I believe. And then, it is that same community that will select who the grantees will be. And unfortunately, I wish we had, more funds, but it's what we have. And so we're thinking about our NALAC fund for the arts for next year, because this year we're focused on COVID funding, and we have that 1.25 million that we're going to put out in October for artists and organizations. And we have the Catalyst for Change grant that's really looking at supporting 12 artists working around racial justice, social justice in their communities, working with community, but really thinking about the future of the NFA. How do we, even though we have panels that are, of course, artists from the field, and they make the decisions, we don't, about who gets supported, but really being more strategic and more thoughtful on about how we make these grants and how artists and organizations, even though they've been part of how we form our grant program, can have more of a say, you know, and participate and in how we shape this, you know, because with the NALAC Fund for the Arts, if we have $300,000 to award in 1 year, we get hundreds, almost 1,000 applications, you know, and it's just like people are going through this process of applying and, you know, there's only so much that we have, you know, and it's just, it's something that we're looking at and thinking about, you know, how do we be more supportive of more artists, more organizations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right before I go to the first question, I have Juan Manuel. Get ready to unmute your microphone, Juan Manuel, and also your camera if you want to share your video. I was very lucky to be a part of the NALAC Advocacy Leadership Institute this year. And we had an amazing conversation with the National Endowment for the Arts. And one of the things that they were telling us, and I think that this is an open invitation, we should go into the panels that are reviewing the grants, basically, because a lot of times they do not have enough people who are culturally, you know, equipped to explain what's going on within a grant. So you have a narrative that is very complex, and it makes a lot of sense for your community. But if you know, like if there is not a Latinx person in the table saying like, oh, this application for a Day of the Dead program makes sense because this is the context, right? If there are not those voices present, it's going to be very hard that they value the work that we are putting forward. So it's not only the submitting the applications, but it's also when you're not submitting an application, sit at that table, because that is ultimately what equity looks like. And now let's go to Juan Manuel, please.
Hi, hola, buenas noches, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you,
Hola.
Miguel and Maria, for that just a fantastic conversation and those precise questions, Miguel and Maria, for your expansive, just responsives and care for the work that you do. Maria, I just wanted to ask you a question, and also Miguel, maybe if you want to jump in on this too. I put it on the chat, but I'll just read it out loud here. Maria, in your conversation about Texas, I hear that there's sort of this conservatism and perhaps patriarchal machista sort of dimensions, even amongst the new wealth accumulating Latinos in the US. And so what are some of the challenges or opportunities that you see sort of in Latinx philanthropy that artists work through or new organizations sort of work through? Because in my mind, I feel like philanthropy has been largely seen as a mainly white dominated space. Mm-hmm. And so are we talking about different types of philanthropies, and how is white philanthropy similar to or different from Latinx philanthropy? Are there different things that you take into consideration when you ask for funds from different foundations, say from the Rockefeller Foundation, as different from the Gutierrez Foundation, you know, those types of foundations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there is a difference, you know, there is more of a sensibility to really support a specific community. For example, the Castellano Foundation, which was founded by the late Carmen Castellano and Al Castellano. In California, ¿verdad? You know, they created that foundation, and through and now, you know, it's been passed on to the next generation. But they're focused on providing support to Latinx artists and organizations in the Bay Area, right? And so the way that they make their decisions, you know, I'm not privy to it, you know, but the focus of their support has been to build up that Latino arts and culture community. And so I think that's needed. That is very much needed, because, you know, we don't have a lot of places as a Latinx community to get that support. And I think so that we have an opportunity now as our you know, demographic and our financial and economic positions as Latinos, as Latinx improve, to begin to think about that. So what is our responsibility, you know, to speak those Latinx philanthropic organizations and say, hey, let's create something new, let's create something different, you know. And for us at NALAC, you know, as we're beginning to think about changing the very competitive process that we go through, that you know, we're analyzing it and thinking about how can we be more strategic, you know. Pero I think that sí hay oportunidad. There is an opportunity to change and create something different. It doesn't have to be the framework that exists in the mainstream.
I don't know that I have a specific answer for that. Also, hi, Juan Manuel, so nice to see you. But I will just say, I want to kind of also bring into the conversation, you know, these are also just my personal obsessions, but like these big foundations like Ford, or, you know, just as a reminder, and I've said this in the talk last June that I had with Edgar Villanueva, they're only mandated to give out 5% of their assets every year.
Right.
That's the mandate. They have to give out a minimum payout of 5%. And I don't, you know, I'm not so privy to, you know, we can all look at their Form 990 online. You can go to any big foundation and see where their money is going. It's public information. But that says there's 95% of their assets that are in the stock market, right? There's the assumption that these foundations should exist forever, in perpetuity, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Rockefeller Foundation initially encountered tons of resistance governmentally when he tried to form the foundation in the early 1900s. The government was against it. The president was against it. They said no one person should have this much sway on American democracy. And yet he went back to New York State and he got a charter and it worked. And here we are still with this foundation. They wanted to, you know, originally the government wanted to see that number go down in 50 years, the assets. And so now we have the situation, like, and you know, I asked the question, why can't these foundations give 10% of their assets, 20% of their assets? Why can't the Ford Foundation say, you know what, we're gonna spend down these assets over the next 20 years so we can give this to as many people as possible, you know, which then they could staff, they could absorb, not like they could absorb all these things that they fund, these intermediate organizations, and then just expand the amount of money that goes out. I mean, that's one idea, right? But it was just to say, like, there is more money. There is more money. And so I'm very suspicious of these structural systems that appease these larger scale organizations where they say, oh, well, we're giving to Latino artists because we give money to NALAC, right? Yep. And it's like, NALAC is the one organization that is charged with this responsibility. And so equity means everybody has to get invested in the well-being of communities of color, artists who need support, not just shelling it, not creating even these kinds of divisions that you just articulated, you know, between the white philanthropy, Latinx philanthropy, you know, all this kind of stuff. To me, that's colonialism just continuing.
Absolutely. So, and I agree with you 100%. You know, liberate the money, you know, spend out the money. Really.
I love that concept. We have time for one more question, and in the meantime, while we wait, I'd love to share two ideas. The first one is here in San Francisco, we created this concept of a cultural district. We have currently 7 cultural districts. This is a model that is actually being pretty successful, and it's been replicated in different cities across the United States, in which, you know, with the neighborhoods and the local artists, we organize to pass this legislation that allocates money directly for the district. And basically the way that we did it was, you know, by marching, by taking the streets, by you know, pushing our supervisors into that model that and then the second thing that we did, since, you know, San Francisco has been very pushed by gentrification. The last 10 years, we have lost 80% of our artists in the city. What we did is we passed a special tax a hotel tax that would allocate money specifically for the arts and culture in the city of San Francisco. And this is now what we are trying to access as artists in these districts. We're trying to access these funds to actually bring this money into our communities. But you know, these are ideas that aren't written, that aren't created before. These are things that we just need to kind of like go with our gut. And you know, I feel like the role of the arts in general is to push the boundaries of what's socially acceptable and recognized. But I think that very often, because our relationship with money as artists is that, you know, the artist is not supposed to be making enough money, is not supposed to be thriving from being an artist. We don't demand what we deserve. I mean, I have 2-3 jobs to pay for my artistic practice. So why can't I have like a, you know, house or something? We have a question. Oh, Juan Manuel, would you like just come back? Just.
Oh, I mean, if other folks have questions, I'm just chatting using all forms, but I don't want to definitely take the conversation.
Una mujer. We need to hear from Fem.
Por favor,
We need
yes.
Femergy.
Fem-energy.
Diana Lara had some great comments here.
Diana was sharing that Honduras was sadly a good example of a colonized system of art funding in which the theaters and artists are funded by the international cooperation from France, Spain, and Holland. The government is so weak and corrupt that the funding for the arts is meager or inexistent. International funding, is that reliable? Is that a good idea? What do you think?
For us, it has not been. And corporate funding is another, you know, that always has so many things tied to it, always to the money, right? To what they're going to get in return. What's their return on their investment, you know? And yeah, and I hear you, Arturo, you know, and about how this activism and this organizing and this change has to come from the community. We cannot rely on the governmental systems, on philanthropy to make these changes unless we demand it, and that there's enough, you know, strength and enough collective voices asking for this kind of change.
Totally. Mia has a question. Hey, Mia, welcome.
Thank you, Maria and Miguel, and to everyone. This has been really great, and it's nice to hear very explicit, I think, conversations on these topics that anybody who has ever had to apply for a grant, whether for themselves or for an organization, has been very aware of and thought a lot about for a long time. Maria, we haven't met, but I work with the Esperanza Center. I'm working on the founding of the Museo del West Side. And I'm also a PhD student in art history at Yale, and I actually study the rise of multiculturalism and the sort of changes in funding structures that resulted from the culture war. So it's very useful for me to hear both from the perspective of funders and sort of institutional advocates and from artists. And I guess one thing that has come to mind during this conversation is, I suppose, you know, we've been talking about the hustle, we've been talking about the game, and I think we all understand that we're in a certain kind of system that, despite the fact that we may not agree on it, we do have to pay our bills and survive and want to figure out a way for our practices to be sustainable. But it's also making me think about the word abolition that's been circulating a lot lately. And I think it's a word that a lot of us are having to grapple with in a real way for the first time. I think a lot of people are having to learn what it means, that it's not so much about destroy everything or even just destroy capitalism, but it's really about exactly what we're talking about in this room, which is inventing sort of future conditions in the present, or sort of almost like speculatively trying to make real ways of working that provide us some kind of opening. And so all of the suggestions that people are making, like I think the idea of the caracols is really interesting, but then it's also making me think, you know, one thing that was brought up is how institutionally we always have to assume that these foundations will exist in perpetuity, that NALAC will have to exist forever. Because as a 501c3, right, you have a staff, you want to survive. So you keep sort of reproducing your own institutional structure, even if it's one that has been created by, as Miguel said, the lack of public funding for social services, for example, or public funding for the arts. So what would it mean to sort of play the game in the present with the goal of abolition in mind? So what are ways that we can think about taking the money and sort of blowing things up, more or less? What does it mean to, I mean, what would it look like for an institution like NALAC to ask itself, how could we say that in 10 years we won't be needed anymore? What would be the things that would have to happen for us to get to that point? And likewise, I think for Miguel, it seems to me that something that you've come to in your practice is using transparency around these kinds of administrative issues, especially since, because of the way that institutional infrastructures have changed, the sort of artistic gig economy forces us all to become our own administrators. And it seems like one of the things that you've taken on for yourself as a way of blowing things up is trying to make these processes more transparent. So I wanted to hear a little bit about that work that you've been doing in your upcoming podcast too.
Well, nice to meet you, Mia. I look forward to seeing you in San Antonio, hopefully sometime, or connecting more with you. And I hear you, you know, about abolition. So for NALAC not to exist, you know, to say we're only going to exist for the next 10 years, and so how do you eliminate racism and white supremacy? How do you eliminate that, you know? And if that's still in play, you know, even if NALAC is not around, you know, the struggle will have to continue. The struggle for equity, the struggle to dismantle these racist, you know, the infrastructure that exists. Yeah, I mean, I'm not thinking that. I wish that those things would change, and that NALAC and other organizations like the Esperanza and others, you know, didn't need to be there to really uplift our communities, uplift their voices, you know, advocate. Pero the reality is that that needs to change first.
Absolutely.
Those systems have to be abolished, dismantled before we can say, okay, we can walk away. Our work is done here, you know. And NALAC is just one organization. You know, the more organizations there are supporting artists, supporting community, different organizations or service organizations, the better. The more opportunities artists have, the better for us.
Certainly. And I mean, it's not at all to discount the work of any of these organizations, because clearly it's so important, and absolutely if it did not exist, there would be so many who would not get the resources they need. It's just, I think for me, the question is more, if we put abolition on the table, what can it open up in our conversations? If we try to bring into our imaginary the possibility that capitalism is not the only way, or that
absolutely,
the system we're in might not be the one.
Absolutely. Be open to change, to make that change.
Yeah.
I would just add to it, my intention with this is always to sort of break down certain walls, and also break down fear, and keep finding ways for artists to not feel like we are in this kind of very paternalizing system, or infantilizing system, where our worth is exclusively seen from these different kinds of institutional affirmations, and having a real conversation about that. And particularly because I come from dance, I feel like there is such an embedded script of gratitude in the world of dance around, like, the chance to even just get to do what you do because you love it, y todo eso. And I look to visual art for its inspiration, and at least there has been a tradition of institutional critique. You know, at least there has been a conversation about the institution. I think in dance and performance, we're very scared of this conversation because of the little resources that we receive. But I feel like we have to stop being scared about it, and people like, you know, Maria and me, and I only can do this because I feel like I've been very successful. I have the courage, maybe, or I don't think of it as courage. I feel like it was responsibility. But I think of all the artists who haven't had the opportunities that I've had, and how they're not empowered to have these conversations with the gatekeepers, and that's just like, that's just frustrating to me, because I also think a lot of the gatekeepers have really great intentions, actually. I've never met a funder who was like, well, I wish we could give less money. You know, like I've only ever met funders that were like, we want to give more. But, you know, I think it's about these kinds of, for me, transparency and also information, you know, politicization of the process. You know, you'll hear me say this a million times. We aren't going to hear about art during this whole presidential campaign, you know, where no one's going to talk about it. The NEA fund, you know, the budget for the NEA is the same that it's been for 40 fucking years. And, you know, it's actually gone down from its highest point in the early 90s, right? So, I'm not looking to the NEA to be the savior of any of this, but just that we don't, you know, $155 million, that's how much this country thinks art is worth, you know? Bloomberg spent almost $1 billion on a failed presidential campaign, right? So it's just, these are the kinds of scales that I want us to understand, that we're working with, and look for ways to advocate. And I think also this system is exactly the thing that is so tricky to me, because how do we have criticality to each other? How can I have criticality towards NALAC? But then NALAC is also this incredible organization, right? So we're put in these very strange relationships to each other. I need you, you need me, but the funder has the job. You know? Like, it's like, you know, at the end of the day, like the people in the office, they have the job, right? And the artists are kind of like Arturo was saying before, like, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to, you know, like, so these are different sorts of challenges that I see.
And the program officers at a lot of those foundations, you know, now more and more, there's more Latinx and program officers of color. Still not enough, but it's those boards that many times keep them from, you know, supporting the way that they want. But still, there's not enough money being loosened up, you know, and provided.
Thank you so much. Mil gracias. That was a really furtive conversation, and I was just really glad to be part of it. And all these flaquistas who came, some of our dancers who've participated in FLACC had great comments and conversations between them. So yeah, this was really great, and we hope for more. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Arturo. Everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.